Order. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee is continuing its inquiry into Israel and Palestine. Today we have 3 panels of experts. The first panel has 3 witnesses appearing virtually and 1 here in the room. I should warn, I'm afraid, the witnesses and the public and those watching online that we have been told that there will be some votes in the chamber which could be quite disruptive, and all I can do is to apologise in advance and hope that they're not as bad as we're all imagining they might be. But before we go any further, could I ask the witnesses please to introduce themselves, and perhaps if I begin with Victor Kattan, sitting in the room.
Good afternoon. My name is Victor Kattan. I'm an assistant professor of public international law at the University of Nottingham, the author of 5 books on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and a former legal advisor to the Palestinian Negotiation Affairs Department.
And Dr. Baskin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Gershon Baskin from Jerusalem. I am currently the Middle East director for a British-based NGO called International Communities Organization. I'm a veteran political activist in Israel, have advised 2 prime ministers on the peace process, and conducted secret direct back channels on behalf of the Israeli government with Hamas during the negotiations in 2011 for the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit.
Thank you. And Sinijlawi.
I'm Sinijlawi. I'm a political activist from Jerusalem, and I am the chairman of Jerusalem Development Fund.
Thank you. And Colonel Eisin?
My name is Miri, and I'm from the Tel Aviv area, at the moment in New York, but usually from Tel Aviv. And I am a senior fellow at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism. I'm a former advisor to Prime Minister Olmert during the years of both negotiations as they went on. And I'm also involved in all of the different back channels that are done, Israeli-Palestinian, Arab, and further.
Thank you. Before we start asking questions, there is a lot to cover today, so we won't ask every question to everyone. But if you do want to come in, please indicate. And I would ask if you could keep your answers as concise as possible, it would be greatly appreciated, and we can then perhaps get through everything that we want to without running out of time, despite the votes as well. So perhaps I can begin with asking a question to each panel member, perhaps even a yes or no question. Do you call for a 2-state solution? I wonder if I could start with Victor Kattan.
Yes, but of course that's something for the Palestinian and Israeli people to decide on.
Yeah. And Dr. Baskin?
Most definitely. There is no other solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict except the 2-state solution. Despite the past 30 years of failed peace process, it remains the only solution to this conflict.
And Sinijlawi?
Yes, I support the 2-state solution.
Okay. And Colonel Eisin?
I support the 2-state solution. I very much what was said by the colleagues before. It's up to people, but it takes leadership. And I agree with Gershon that there is no other resolution that can work. I don't like the word solution, so you'll excuse me in that sense. I'm very much into words. Can we call it a resolution as opposed to solution?
Can I ask you, though, Colonel Eisin, in more detail, what are the conditions that we need to be able to establish a 2-state solution that might be sustainable? And what has changed since October the 7th?
You need leadership, and leadership is not necessarily individual people. Leadership is something broader. You actually have to have a desire to do so. I think that right now the Israeli leadership, or certainly the government, doesn't have a desire, and you have to have both the leadership and the desire. You need to address things in a realistic way. This isn't a happily ever after resolution. It is, to me, the hard reality of the only one that can work and is the best for both sides, but it's not a Disney happily ever after. So you need to address straight on the main issues, 6 issues on the table that we talk about all the time. You have to define borders. You have to define the sovereignty. You have to understand security needs, and you have to resolve the settlements. You need to address Jerusalem, and you have to talk about refugees and the right of return. Every one of those 6 issues that I mentioned are things that have been spoken about. I understand the parameters. That doesn't make it easy. As I said, it takes the leadership and the will, but it is doable, and it's something that is needed just as much today as it was not just 30 years ago, but for the last 75 years.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Baskin?
100%. I would only add to it that the change of leadership is required on the Palestinian side, not just on the Israeli side. What is absent in this conflict, and what we've seen for the last 2 decades at least, is a situation where a majority of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians will say, I want peace, but they don't. And unfortunately, both Israelis and Palestinians have been able to point to the things that have been done by the people who represent them in government that prove the point that there was no political will for a solution to this conflict or resolution to the conflict. What we need is to hear loud voices on both sides speaking of the desire to live in peace in order to rebuild the belief that there are partners for peace, because along with leadership, we need our people to believe that the other side is genuinely interested in living in peace, and that will create the majority on both sides that we need.
What role do you think, Dr. Baskin, the Arab Accords might play in securing a 2-state solution? I wonder, Dr. Baskin, could you help us with what the Arab Accords what role? I'm sorry?
What went wrong in the peace
what am I saying?
process?
The Abraham Accords. Sorry, yeah. The Abraham Accords.
Look, we have a peace process that from the outset got off on the wrong footing because there was no end game stated from the outset. So we had was the ability for the parties to continue negotiating for many years. There was a belief in the process that we would get to know each other, we would work together, we would build models of cooperation, and through the trust that would develop, we would be able to negotiate the hardcore issues that Miri Eisin spoke about. What in fact happened was that rather than spiraling a building up of trust, we had a derailing of the process and a spiraling down between the parties, so that when they finally got to negotiate the core issues in the conflict, there was no trust, there was no confidence, there was no belief that a resolution of these issues could be found between the parties. And then, of course, we had the use of violence in the second Intifada, started by the Palestinians and continued by the Israelis in reoccupying the occupied territories. And with the second Intifada back in the year 2000 to 2004 or 5, we had the destruction of the Israeli and Palestinian peace camps. And by that time, we also had non-peace leaders come to power, who eventually led to Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2009, who's maintained a policy, a strategy of ensuring that there is no possibility for making peace by ensuring the separation of the Palestinian leadership, which they all too willingly agreed to collaborate with, and a situation where there was no political will for a 2-state solution. In fact, a dead set policy of Israel to ensure that there would be no 2-state solution.
Thank you for that answer. I mean, it's a very interesting and comprehensive answer. Where the only problem I would say, sir, is that if we answer all the questions at such length, we won't be able to get through.
Yeah, sorry.
But I mean, it is very interesting, and I'm very glad that we have all of that detail on the record. But can I ask Sinijlawi about the 2-state solution and about, if it happens, is there a continuing place for Palestinians and Arabs in Israel or Israeli Jews in Palestine? Or would there be population swaps? How do you think it might work?
Well, the 2-state solution does not mean that there will be a pure Israeli Jewish state and a pure Palestinian state. In the 2-state solution, still 20% of its population will continue to be Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, and Christians who are currently Israeli citizens. And within the Palestinian independent state on the borders of 67, I think we still need to be able to accommodate those Jewish settlers who would like to stay within the borders of the Palestinian state under the Palestinian sovereignty and law, as Israeli citizens but resident of the states. Those who wish to call their home Hebron or Nablus or Beit El or wherever they would like to feel connected and would like to continue their lives, they should be able to continue living there. So in a way or another, also we as a Palestinian state, we will have another 18 to 20% of our inhabitants as Israeli citizens resident of the state of Palestine.
I think that we want to move on to questions about negotiating a peace deal, and I think that Uma has some questions.
Thank you, Chair. To the full panel, but perhaps I could start with you, Dr. Baskin. Is it possible to reach a long-term settlement of the conflict in stages, starting with a ceasefire, or should there be a simultaneous effort with the ceasefire and future solution negotiations being conducted in parallel?
I think that the first thing that needs to be done is the war in Gaza needs to end, and it needs to end now. Not even another day of warfare needs to go on. But this is a complex issue that if we want a sustainable end to the war in Gaza, there has to be a political process running in parallel with it that guarantees that the two-state solution is what we're focused on. There needs to be a new leadership in Gaza replacing Hamas, which is organically linked to the Palestinian Authority, appointed perhaps by President Mahmoud Abbas, but independent from him because he has no legitimacy, very little in the West Bank and zero in Gaza. So there needs to be some kind of independent Palestinian administration in Gaza. But then we need to focus also on what's going on in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and in Israel itself. And there must be a commitment by the local leadership, the Israelis and the Palestinians and the international community, that the two-state solution is where we are heading. And then we can talk about a process that could be implemented over 3 to 5 years, whatever it would take. But we need that end game out in front and explicit.
I'm so sorry. We have a vote, so I need to stop proceedings at the moment. So order. The sitting is. is going to resume. Uma, do you mind carrying on with your questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, panel, for your patience. Is it possible to reach a long-term settlement of the conflict in stages, starting with a ceasefire, or should there be a simultaneous effort with a ceasefire and a future solution negotiations being conducted in parallel? Sorry, Dr. Gershon, you've answered this, so I will go to any of the other witnesses if you want to come in.
Would you like me to come
I'm
in?
happy to jump in, or is Samir, are you going to be jumping in?
Someone.
Sure, I'll leave it to you, and who goes first?
I'd like to jump in. I'd also like to address the previous question. So I agree with what's been said about the outcome, the aims, issues that still need to be negotiated. But I guess where I disagree is how we get there. And one word I didn't hear, which surprised me a little, is the word justice, because we can't reverse the clocks to 2008, to the Olmert presidency, which preceded the first conflict in the Gaza Strip. Operation Cast led 2008 and 2009, all the subsequent conflicts in the Gaza Strip, not to mention the current conflict, which is the worst. It's led to over 40,000 deaths, possibly many more. And what's key here is how do you heal society, but also how do you take into account developments that have occurred since the last major negotiations? We have the arrest warrants that have been issued by the pre-trial chamber of the International Criminal Court. And the prosecutor has hinted that more are on the way. We have an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which has declared that the occupation is unlawful, the settlements are unlawful, settlers must be withdrawn, refugees who were displaced in 1967 must be allowed to return. So these are new factors, these are new matters that any future negotiation or discussion would have to take into account. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. Miriam, I think you were going next. Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in and I'll tail end in a moment for the comments, but I want for a moment to address the combo of questions, because you said after October 7th. And here I'd like to say October 7th is not something just to gloss over. It changed Israeli society. We're living it in a way that the rest of the world does not view, and I just heard a vastly different view. And when I say that, it's a scar for us that still continues. And when I say a scar, it's something that we have to live with and we have to face, and it's not over yet. And part of that, the portion that has to do with, so what do you do looking into the future, is that many Israelis that I would say we're totally in that 70% peace camp, two-state resolution, try to arrive at something which isn't a happily ever after, but it's the best of all of the challenges. Today are saying, how do I get to a resolution with somebody who calls for my destruction? And that question is not just about Hamas as it was in the past. I say sadly for myself that for many of the people in the area around the Gaza Strip from different communities there that were completely in the peace camp, felt that in addition to the harsh jihad, I don't want to say jihadi, the harsh Hamas elements and of what they did on October 7th, that you saw regular people, as I like to call it, joining in, and in that sense, making it that much more difficult. So when you look forward, it's not about imposing, it's about dialogue, and that's always a challenge, but it's also about addressing the fears on both sides. My heart goes out to not just the people of the Gaza Strip, to Palestinians. That's so patronizing for me to say as an Israeli, but to the conflict that we're in, which is a harsh one for both sides. I can't make myself less independent from the independence that I declared, not that I was alive, on May 14th, 1948. I don't have to degrade myself. I don't have to be less because we have not yet arrived at a resolution. And the last thing that I'll say because of that is because the term justice is who, sir, gets to define justice. And I say that to all sides. That term is something that always scares me. It's something that when it always comes in, especially into this conflict, when you get into something where it's about justice, you're never going to arrive at a resolution because everybody views that in different ways. But you can arrive at a realistic type of resolution of two different states that are next to each other, that are not good friends. They don't love each other, even though they're going to be intricately combined. There's no way to do it otherwise. And if you put the word justice in, sadly, I think that you're then taking it out of the room. It's not going to happen. That's my opinion, but I wanted to state it very clearly.
Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. The Chair kicked off the session by asking all of you if you still support the two-state solution. And this inquiry is looking at the UK's role, the FCDO's role here in the UK, and its contribution to securing a lasting peace. And maybe, Victor Kattan, I can start with you. What would be the significance of the UK declaring its recognition of a Palestinian state at this point in time?
I think it would be extremely significant, and it's long overdue. You may recall that William Hague, when he was the Foreign Secretary back in 2011, stood before Parliament, the House of Commons, and said that the Palestinian National Authority largely meets the criteria of statehood in international law so far as the occupation allows. The following year, there was a vote at the United Nations that conferred observer state status on Palestine. The UK abstained, but they acknowledged that Palestine was a state because they put some conditions for their vote in favour, and one of them was they wanted Palestine to delay the vote and to delay joining the International Criminal Court. Only states can be members of the International Criminal Court, so the UK effectively recognised that Palestine was a state. But they withheld recognition for reasons that were connected to negotiations, which made sense in 2012 and 2013 and 2014 at the last round of negotiations. There have been no serious negotiations in the last 10 years. The argument that we will withhold recognition until it's the right time doesn't make sense in the absence of negotiations. When you have a government which has effectively annexed the West Bank, this was the International Court of Justice dealt with this in detail. The Knesset passed a law saying they are flatly reject two states, even a negotiated state, in July of this year. You have the nation-state law passed in 2018, a constitutional statute saying only the Jewish people have an exclusive right to self-determination in the land of Israel. And the current coalition government's platform is the land of Israel includes what they call Judea and Samaria. So you have annexation. You have no chance at the moment with the current government of a two-state solution. However, that doesn't mean that the UK should not recognise Palestine, because one of the arguments that is being used by the right wing is that the status is disputed. And so long as they don't have full recognition by all members of the international community, that argument can be sustained. But once the UK and other Commonwealth countries, France, they could get together, issue recognition before Trump enters office, that could make a change, that could shift the dynamics, I would suggest.
Thank you. Gershon, Baskin, can I ask you the same question? What would be the significance?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there is a historic need for the United Kingdom to recognize the state of Palestine. It should have been done. I agree with Professor Kattan as well. It should have been done long ago. I think that we need to recognize that does not end the occupation, but it is an important step in principle. I think, in fact, the call by the United Kingdom to the international community is that all 193 member states of the United Nations need to recognize both states. There are 146 countries that recognize Palestine and 165 that recognize Israel. And the call, if we're supporting the two-state solution, should be a universal recognition of the entire international community of both the state of Israel and the state of Palestine on the basis of the 1967 borders. I think that's also an important addition, because even President Trump, when he issued his vision for the future in 2020, essentially put a two-state solution on the table. But his vision was a two-state solution based on 70% of the West Bank, where there was very little sovereignty and very little control of borders and not much territorial contiguity of that Palestinian state. So I think the reference to the 1967 border should also be there.
Thank you. And Colonel Eisin, just reflecting on your comments in your last answer, I was wondering, when I was listening to you, what you thought the role for other state actors in resolving this peace would be. So obviously you have two sides who are vehemently opposed to each other. Is it not that the international community needs to take steps to force a peace from outside in the region?
It's a magnificent question, which isn't one that you just answer in a yes or no. They should or they shouldn't. I don't know of peace. And in that sense, I'm saying peace, not loving each other and hugging each other, but in arriving at a resolution that I would love to have of what I call non-war, because I've been living in a horrific war for the last 14 months and horrific for all sides. I think that what you're asking in that sense is how much involvement. I do not think that the two sides know how to come to the table and arrive at any kind of a resolution without outside help. We don't. That challenge of how we view each other, the disconnect in that sense. We have such vastly different narratives and histories that don't align, and we need to acknowledge. And I think both Dr. Baskin and myself, Samuel for that matter, we're all involved in those kind of groups. We're the exception to the rule. The bulk of Israelis, the bulk of Palestinians, both in Israel, Palestine, and around the world, don't talk to each other. And so it isn't about dialogue. We need somebody to facilitate. But to arrive at the hard decisions, I'm going to push back on the one element. As I said before, I need to arrive at that two states, but I'm not willing to help establish a state that is going to be taken over by Hamas, that is going to be run by somebody who openly calls for my destruction, and it isn't a little element. So yes, I need the outside involvement, but to a certain degree, I need that acknowledgement that not all of the Palestinians, and I'm not willing to have the comparison between Hamas and the government of Israel. I've pushed back with that completely. Throughout the last 14 months, I think that what the ICC did is horrific, criminal. You cannot put the elected government officials that I detest, but that has nothing to do with it, on the same page as what Hamas did on October 7th.
Sorry, Colonel, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We've got a limited amount of time, and at the risk of asking you to restrain yourselves to answering the question rather than debating each other, which you're free to do after this.
I appreciate that.
John.
Colonel, you set out the 6 priorities, one of which was security and another leadership. You've also set out why Israel probably has less confidence in security with the existing leadership in the Palestinian side following the events of October 7th, and Mr. Kattan has expressed a view about the hardline leadership in Israel making it less likely. Do you think that any settlement is going to be possible without a change in leadership on both sides?
No, I think that you have to have a change of leadership on both sides. I think that the leadership in Israel does not want a settlement. I agree completely with Dr. Baskin. And I also think that the Palestinian leadership that exists right now is just so not supported. It's not just the leadership. I said it's the leadership and people. And I want to hope that we will have a change of leadership. I'm going to hope that this horrific war, at least in Israel, will bring about a change of leadership. I have to hope.
And is that the view of all of our witnesses?
Samer,
very quickly.
Please, very quickly.
Well, yes, definitely a change of leadership is the first step towards achieving political. With the current leadership, if we still will be having one of the 3 triangle, Hamas, Abbas, or Bibi, we will not be able to move ahead. We need to have all of them disappear from the political scene, and then I think the horizon will open. The 7th of October and the war has brought us closer to a political solution. It did not distance us, because once the war will end, it may end tomorrow, it may end in 1 year. Again, we will find ourselves 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews living in the same piece of land. Nothing has changed. And then we will discover that we have no other choice but peace.
I think that Dr. Baskin has made it clear that he also thinks that you should have a change of leadership, and I believe Victor Kattan.
I agree, but I think it goes beyond leadership.
What we're going to do is try and get on to the other issues, and I want to ask Eisin to ask some questions about settlements.
Settlements. Just one question on recognition, if I may. So this question is for Gershon. Gershon, you said recognition is required, but it doesn't end because of the occupation. So my question to you is, we've spoken about individuals being responsible and leadership being required in the region. The Knesset in July of this year overwhelmingly voted against the recognition of a Palestinian state. So it wasn't just one individual or a couple of individuals, it was overwhelmingly against recognition. So how do we move forward when Israel as a parliament as a whole has made it clear, not just in language, but now in law, that recognition for Palestinians would not be something that they move forward with? So how do we move forward when that's the state of a parliament, not an individual?
Well, I think that this parliament has no justification or legitimacy amongst the general Israeli public. An overwhelming majority of Israelis want us to go to new elections, and they want us to do that now. The quality of our leadership in our parliament is the lowest that we've had in 75 years. And I think there's very little argument about that amongst the majority of Israelis. The law that was passed by this Knesset, this parliament, against a Palestinian state can be easily reversed by the reality on the ground of real negotiations and moving forward toward the two-state solution. There are many hard issues that we need to deal with. That settlements is one of the most difficult, but there are solutions that have been proposed over the years for dealing with all these solutions. This Knesset, this parliament, is not an obstacle to moving forward because it won't be there for very long. We still have some remnants of democracy in Israel, and we will have new elections, and most of the sitting members of parliament will not be in the next parliament.
Thank you, Gershon. So I'll come on to settlements now, if I may. So question for you, Victor, if I may. So the ICJ ruling of this year ruled that the settlements were unlawful. How do you think this has a play on any future recognition for Palestinian state, given the fact that the ICJ opinion ruling said that the settlements in the West Bank are unlawful?
So actually the ICJ first ruled that the settlements are unlawful 20 years ago, and then they reiterated it again over this summer. But they went further and they said not only the settlements are lawful, but they must all be removed. The extent to which that might be realistic is something that could be addressed in negotiations. There have been examples in the past in colonial situations where settlers, hundreds of thousands, were relocated back to their countries.
There are about 400,000 flats, aren't there?
400,000
flats that are in the settlements. So we're talking about 400,000.
I know, but there are examples from history.
I just want to...
Yes, of hundreds of thousands of people from Algeria, from Mozambique, returning to their countries. There is a proposal Samir mentioned. There was discussed when I was a negotiator, never formally, of granting permanent residency to some of the settlers as part of a negotiated. I don't think it has broad support, but that is an option. But that would be a concession on the part of the Palestinians, and only they could decide that, given what the International Court of Justice has said about the settlements. So that would be my short answer.
And just following on from this, Gershon or Miriam, if possible. So the Palestinian side, perhaps we could look at the individuals there being recognised potentially as Palestinian nationals, or what would this be for how would this be perceived from the Israeli side? So what view will they take as a country in terms of individuals who might be settled on the West Bank, and those individuals potentially becoming nationals of Palestine potentially in the future? Sorry, that's a very hypothetical question of something that may happen. I think what I'm trying to get to, the point I'm trying to get to is, if there are settlements there, what happens to those individuals from an Israeli perspective?
In the past, I can't say into the future, Israel always said that we would remove all of the settlers from within the Palestine state because we didn't think that they would be secure there. I say it sadly. And so, I mean, as I said, it's not a happily ever after. If they would stay there, I don't think that they would be secure. And when you remove them, that is a huge endeavor, which I think is possible, not impossible. But again, that's in the future negotiations. And I'll just add that at least in the negotiations in the past, and I know that this isn't something everybody likes, but it's about that if you deviate not that much from the 67 line, if you take and also give, but you change the line, and you're allowed to change lines, they're defined by human beings, then you do resolve an immense amount of the relocation of people, because the main large settlements, the large ones, are very close to the 67 line, and if you take, then you give. But I'm just saying that that's also something to take into account.
Thank you.
Right, and just to support that, according to data, if Israel were to annex 4.4% of the West Bank in exchange for equal territory inside of Israel, we would incorporate 80% of the Israeli settlers under Israeli sovereignty. Part of the territory that would be granted to the Palestinians and part of the land swap would be the Gaza-West Bank corridor, which would account for about 1% of the land that Israel could possibly annex. There is an agreement, at least between two former leaders, former Prime Minister Olmert and former Palestinian Foreign Minister Nasser al-Qudwa, on this plan, which advocates this 4.4 land swap.
So my final question to you, Simon, is do you think that the intention is there from the Israeli government on having recognition or a two-state solution, given the fact that the settlements in the West Bank are continued? Well, they continue the expansion, so the expansion is continuing, and with obviously the potential annexation in the north of Gaza, do you think that the intention is there?
Well, the intention is in the opposite direction. I think the current Israeli government is planning to extend sovereignty in the West Bank and maybe on Gaza also. But this does not reflect the Israeli public. We might be misled when we think that most of the Israelis are anti the two-state solution. I think most of the Israelis by nature will support the two-state solution. They are currently confused. Millions of Israelis are hostages in the bunkers of Bibi Netanyahu. He has manipulated their way of thinking, and once a change in leadership happens on the Israeli side, it will help a lot in creating again a public support to the two-state solution. So the public opinion is not an obstacle. Temporarily, it may be an obstacle, but the main challenge is changing leadership on both sides. That's the first step that can allow us prepare the environment for the implementation of two-state solution. And I would like to say that UK should do more. If you talk to the talk, walk the walk. Currently, the Western governments are speaking a lot about the two-state solution and doing nothing. And I think the current governments, including your government, should start by doing something more in Gaza, at least on the humanitarian aid.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but when you challenge us and say that the British government should be doing more, I think we're very interested to know exactly what it is that you think the British government should do. That would be very helpful.
Well, currently, unfortunately, the British government still is more involved in the war than it is ending the war. There is a lot of cooperation in surveillance and intelligence providing to the Israeli army, which will help the continuation and the operations of the Israeli army in Gaza. And you are doing nothing on humanitarian aid compared with Emirates, for example. Emirates invested up till now around $900 million in humanitarian aid. And I think UK has invested maybe less than 5 million, which is nothing. UK is the second most important country in this conflict after the USA. And USA even, they have technically on the papers declared billions of aid to Gaza, including 600 million for the temporary port that was not functioning, but at least they have allocated funds. The UK did not allocate anything. So the UK should be doing more in humanitarian aid, a huge humanitarian operation in Gaza, and this will help you to be able affecting and having more power into pushing the sides into ending the war. The first step, be involved more in humanitarian aid in Gaza now, immediately.
Okay. Afra, I think you wanted to ask some questions about community cohesion.
Thank you. Colonel Eisin, I'm just asking you initially, how do you think community cohesion can be restored between Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs after the traumatic events of the past year, and how important is restoring that cohesion to creating the trust that we need really as a basis for any long-term agreement?
What you just asked is one of those impossible questions. I don't know how you restore trust. Time, thinking, continuing to meet individuals that are willing to. I think that we need to address it in a realistic way which means how do you go forward between leaders even when you don't have the trust? Because the two-state resolution is something that we need to do anyways. I'm one of those who thinks that separation works better than integration, meaning if each side can, and excuse my terms, licks their wounds on their own, we won't be patronizing to them, which is what we always do. It's not about now rebuilding, talking between all of the different levels. I don't think that's going to work right now. I think that the gaps are too big after the events of October 7th. There are drastically different narratives of the way that October 7th was both presented from October 7th and onward, and those gaps have only gotten wider since October 7th on the events of the day and the aftermath. So to me, it's about wait, breathe in deep, and let leaders talk.
Dr. Baskin, I could see that you wanted to maybe come in on that.
Yeah, there are two things I wanted to say on this one with regard to the role that the UK needs to play. I know that the Prime Minister has been presented with the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace based on the model of the Northern Ireland Fund that was started in the days of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. And this is something that the UK government should be a big part of helping to move civil society in both sides to coming closer. Here I disagree with Miri, Eisin, and I think that conceptualizing peace based on walls and fences is anti-peace. And what we need to do is encourage cross-boundary cooperation. There is no way to build a viable two-state solution without cross-boundary cooperation in every aspect of life that we can imagine, in trade and economy and research and culture, etc. And moreover, I think what is really necessary if we're going to have a speeded up process, we're dealing with two very traumatized populations, the worst trauma that we've experienced, the Jews since the Holocaust and the Palestinians. I believe that this war is worse than the Nakba of 1948 for them, and they're more traumatized than in 1948. We need people of resolve in both communities to stand up and voice remorse. We need people like Sinijlawi, who stands up in front of Israelis who went to Kfar Aza shortly after October 7th, and in Kfar Aza, kibbutz that was grossly attacked by Hamas, and stood there and said, this was done in my name and I'm against it. This is not what we believe in. We've crossed moral red lines. And I think we Israelis and Palestinians who believe this need to stand up and say that both Israel and Palestine have crossed moral red lines in this war. Hamas committed crimes against humanity and war crimes on October 7th, and Israel has been committing war crimes since October 7th. And we need to own up to this, and we need to state it loudly and voice our remorse that this does not represent us and not what we want.
Thank you.
Victor Kattan wants to answer, and then I'm going to go straight to Edward.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I also want to come in on this about healing the societies. And I sense that there's almost a discussion, almost like you're treating Israelis and Palestinians as equals. And in fact, the Palestinians have been occupied for more than 50, almost 60 years. And as regards Hamas, all their leaders, or most of their leaders, are dead. They've had a form of summary justice, if you like. But where not a single Israeli leader has been prosecuted yet. The International Criminal Court would not be involved if the Israeli system prosecuted individuals for which there is evidence of serious and systemic crimes. The fact that the International Criminal Court is involved is a failure. It's a failure of domestic courts. It's a failure of the Israeli legal system. Those Palestinians that have died in some of the most horrific circumstances, how are they going to heal when there's been no justice for them? How are you going to have truth and reconciliation? There needs to be accountability. There needs to be discussions about this. This is a level of violence that is so shocking. I mean, some of the crimes which the prosecutor discussed were children having their legs and their limbs amputated without any anesthetic, for instance. This is cruel, and this was raised as a crime against humanity. There are many more I can go on to. But the point, though, is nobody has been held to account for that. Those who were involved in the awful atrocities on the 7th of October have met justice. They're either dead or they were captured and they are being prosecuted in Israel. But there is no prosecution, no justice for the Palestinians in Gaza and those who have also been harmed in the West Bank. And this needs to be addressed in any future peace discussions, any negotiations.
Good.
Thank you, Chair. We've discussed Palestinian recognition. You've highlighted the need for the UK to increase aid and to cut military support for Israel. Dr. Gershon, you mentioned the Fund for Peace. I'm interested to know from each of the panellists if you think there is a role for the UK in achieving a long-term settlement between Palestine and Israel, and if so, what should the UK be doing outside of the things that we've already outlined? And perhaps, Mr. Sinijlawi, we can start with you.
Well, I think we should focus on the immediate ceasefire, on the immediate end of the war, because there is a human catastrophe that is happening and continuing to happen in Gaza. So the most important issue, the most important target for all of us before discussing any other steps is how to stop immediately the war. Currently, every 15 to 20 minutes, a kid is losing his life in Gaza. So the focus of the UK government should be how to ensure that the war should stop. And I think you have lots of tools to be able to influence Israel to stop this war. So let's focus into this. And then once the war is stopped, the horizons will open. How can we reconstruct Gaza? And how can we reconstruct the trust and confidence between Palestinians and Israelis? All these steps are a task that can be done by leadership. A change in leadership will automatically lead to a process top-down of reconciliation and trust building. If a new, energetic, accountable, transparent Palestinian leadership will come to the scene, and a parallel equivalent Israeli leadership, these leaderships will assume responsibility and will start working through media education into trying to bring the Israelis and Palestinians together. But now, what worries me a lot, how can we stop the war now? We cannot wait another hours, another days. We cannot wait. It should be stopped now, immediately.
So, thank you. The UK has been calling for a ceasefire, so with little impact. So, Colonel Eisin, what should the UK be doing to make a valuable contribution to this process?
First of all, you're there and you have a voice, and I want to say in that sense that you are involved. There are lots of places that are not involved. I absolutely think that in that sense there isn't a list of things that you should be doing that you're not doing. I don't agree with all of my colleagues here, and that's fine. There's disagreement. I think that you should be supporting both sides. And I say that because to me it's not a given. Both in supporting Israel in its right to defend itself with all of the limitations, because I heard some very harsh voices here before on what Israel is doing, and I don't support those voices there. I think that we need to call out what Hamas is to be able to endeavor having a better resolution, and I think those are things that are being done already. And at the end of the day, I don't think that the Israeli Defense Forces in any way are criminals. I think that we are in a horrible war, and every war is horrible.
Dr. Baskin.
Sorry. I'm sorry I have to drop off so I apologize.
Okay. To follow up on Colonel Eisin's point then, is it because the UK has no levers to pull here that we aren't an influencer with either nation?
I think if you had political determination to really help us move forward, then you would take steps that would let the Israeli public understand that, one, you support Israel's right to defend itself, but secondly, you also recognize that Israel's settlement policy and the occupation are unlawful. I think that the fact that there is no distinguishing given by the United Kingdom on Israelis who live in the occupied territories to enter the UK visa-free is something that you need to question. You have an agreement as part of the Schengen agreement that Israeli citizens who live in the state of Israel have visa-free entry into the United Kingdom. But Israeli settlers are not living in the state of Israel. They're living in occupied territory, which is unlawful. And I know that today in the United States, when you don't have a U.S. passport and you want to enter the U.S., you need to fill out some kind of form on the internet, which reviews whether or not you have visa-free access. I think you could do the same thing and establish that Israelis need to write their address. And if they're living in the occupied territories, they should not be granted visa-free entry into the United Kingdom. This is just one of many steps that could be taken.
Okay, Thank you.
I want to say also that just one other sentence. I think it's very important if you want to have trust and confidence of the Israeli government, of the Israeli people, that when we talk about ending the war, as Samer said, we need to also talk about releasing the 100 Israeli hostages. This is very urgent, and we need the Israeli public to hear that from the UK as well. And I'm sure you make those statements.
Kattan, do you have anything to add that you'd like to see the
Yes,
UK
I think
do?
the UK can do a lot. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, we've discussed recognition already. I could say more about that. But there's the issue of arms and trade. The UK has stopped 30 out of 350 licenses. There's scope for more work on that. They haven't come out and said they won't issue new licenses for weapons. They could be clearer on that. There's also the importing of weapons and weapon systems and technology from Israel. They could say more about that. The Irish government, I believe, is passing a bill which could be a model on banning trade with settlements, and that would find support from the International Court of Justice, actually criminalizing individuals and companies that do business with settlements. There could be a freeze on new trade discussions, and there could be the enforcement of existing trade deals, which there's loopholes, and we can still end up with purchasing and dealing with Israeli settlements and Israeli settlement products. So there are things the UK could help with justice initiatives. The UK has a fabulous judiciary, a famous law schools. It's well regarded, highly regarded in this area. There's more that could be done, and there will need to be work that will need to be done in this area. More support for the International Criminal Court, more support for funds and for investigations and for forensic investigations, for humanitarian aid. When the war ends and journalists are allowed into the Gaza Strip to see what has happened, I think people are going to be shocked from what they discover.
Yes. I'm going to take Blair.
Just conscious we're running short of time, I'll ask one question. We're talking about really big issues and quite long-term issues today, but there's obviously a humanitarian crisis at the moment in Gaza, and even the day after the ceasefire, that will be true. After the 2014 Gaza war, there were a lot of international promises about reconstruction that didn't materialise into real impact on the ground. So I wonder, at this time, the day after the ceasefire, what lessons do we learn from past reconstruction failures? Who should pay for the reconstruction? And how do we make sure that reconstruction of Gaza is sustainable?
Who are you asking the question to?
Who am I asking? I'll ask Mr. Sinijlawi first, please.
Well, most of the donors, including the Gulf countries, Europe, USA, and Japan and others, all the wealthy governments, would like to invest in the reconstruction of Gaza, but under one condition: they want to be sure that this is the last war. And to be sure that this is the last war, two conditions must be there. First of all, Israel should withdraw with no return to Gaza, because then if Israel say, I have the right to operation, it means that this country will continue to invest the same amount of money every 5 years in reconstructing Gaza. Then Israel needs to withdraw, and with the intention of not going back. And second, we need to be sure that there will be a new Palestinian regime replacing totally Hamas. Hamas should have no military capability to possess any threat again against Israel. So a replacement, a Palestinian regime that will focus into building a sustainable Gaza, that will focus into political and economical development, and not into building infrastructure that will threaten Israel. So these two conditions are very important. And it's $70-80 billion. It's not an easy job. It needs a lot of planning. It needs a lot of efforts. First step is ending the war. Without ending the war, everything will be illusions. We should focus now, put all our diplomatic, economic tools into action to make sure that this war will end, of course, with the release of the Israeli hostages. But it should be happening now and immediately.
Ask the same question of Dr. Baskin.
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything that Samer just said. I would add to it that Israel also bears responsibility, and at least in the immediate period before the international community, the Gulf states and others can get organized, the easiest, the fastest, and the cheapest way to provide simple things like electricity and water is by connecting Israel to Gaza. Even if that's a temporary measure, it's something that needs to be done immediately. Drawing the Israeli electric line from the Gaza border, from all around the Gaza Strip into Gaza, is something that can be done in less than a month. Pumping in fresh water, even using the Ashkelon desalination plant, which is working at 70% capacity, that extra 30% capacity would supply immediately fresh drinking water for people in Gaza where there is no fresh water, there is no electricity. The humanitarian crisis is one that needs to be addressed in 24 hours from now. Even right now, there's no time to waste. And Israel also bears responsibility and should be demanded that it contribute its part as well.
Professor Kattan.
I agree with everything that's been said. I'll add, though, that the issue of aid, particularly the billions that will have to be donated from Arab countries who will not spend a penny if they think it's going to be destroyed again, actually gives leverage and could actually be a condition for leading to a permanent Israeli withdrawal and the recognition of a Palestinian state. Because when the dust settles and the war is over, they're not going to be able to afford, I think, to administer Gaza or reconstruct it. And that's where the leverage, I think, will come in from donor countries, from the Arab states, and they will be in a position to demand certain conditions before they hand over that kind of money.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you all very much for giving us your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. If when you have after we finish this session, if there is anything that you think that we should have heard from you, and there's any further evidence that you'd like to give, please do write in to us, and we will include that in the evidence. But I would like to thank all of you for giving us your time today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're going to break briefly whilst we change panels. Thank you very much. Our second panel is the head of the Palestine mission in London. Thank you very much for coming today, sir. We really appreciate it. I suppose I ought to start by asking a general question, really, which is, because this is an inquiry into what could the British government do more to be of assistance to ensure that there is peace in the Middle East and to have a lasting peace. And I wondered if you could give us your thoughts on what practical measures the UK could take to ensure a ceasefire in Gaza, but also to build a lasting peace.
Thank you very much, Right Honourable Emily Thornberry and members of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee for this very timely event and convening this conversation at such an acute moment. And in answering this question, I would like to speak with the utmost urgency. We, the Palestinian people, are facing an Israeli attempt at total erasure. Physical, political, and legal, not just in Gaza, and not only for the last 14 months, but for more than a century of settler colonialism. This is happening in clear and gross violations of all standards and norms of international law, international humanitarian law, our shared humanity, and simple common decency. And the absence of any effective intervention by the international community over the past 14 months will leave future generations asking, where were we during this genocide? What did we do? The UK could be instrumental in bringing this mass murder, mass destruction to an end. Britain has a unique historical role in and responsibility for Palestine. It remains an important and influential actor on the international scene. It is one of the founders of the global rules-based order. It has deep and lasting connections to large parts of the world, including our region. And it is a uniquely placed Western power, close enough, right in the middle, with relations to the US, very special relations to the US and the EU. With the EU distracted and the US unpredictable as we speak, the UK is one of the few nations in the world in a position to step forward to fill a vacuum of global leadership at a historic moment of epic danger all over the world. So, honorable members, the immediate priority in Palestine remains securing a lasting ceasefire. That's number one, number two, number three priority for us now. An immediate, permanent ceasefire in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2735, including an exchange of hostages, a full withdrawal of the Israeli army, and a multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza. This must be overseen by the state of Palestine and our legitimate national institutions. There is no other alternative. The unity of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the unity of our territory and people, is represented by one legitimate address. That is the Palestinian government. We must immediately ensure the unfettered access of humanitarian aid to 2.3 million people who are suffering an imposed famine, and all of you are getting the images from the north of Gaza. 37 children have died so far of malnutrition. People have been crushed to death as they were trying to get a loaf of bread. And finally, these images are making it to mainstream media like the CNN and the BBC. So images are disheartening. The highest, this last October was the highest number of Israel preventing international aid from arriving, even in comparison to last year. And not only the imposed famine, but the wholesale destruction of human and material infrastructure, from housing and healthcare to sewage networks and agricultural land. But a ceasefire will not be lasting, my friends. A ceasefire will not be lasting without the clear political understanding and accompanying investment that the issue of Palestine needs to be resolved now. Once and for all. We have got to focus on the root cause. Israel has been clear in word and action that it has no intention of agreeing a ceasefire as of this morning. And I was with our colleagues in Cairo and other places, still foiling several opportunities since November 2023. Israel has been clear over several decades of illegal settlement expansion that it has also no intention of reaching a political outcome other than continued territorial expansion and indefinite military occupation. We have got, right, Honorable Emily, focus on the end game here. And the end game so far is very clear for Israel on the one hand and for us on the other hand. Or as we see now in Gaza, it has turned fully into a genocidal aggression. And therefore, just to touch really on how do we begin to heal this, given what we know already, particularly in light of the International Court of Justice opinion that Israel's occupation is unlawful and must end, that all the settlements are illegal and must be dismantled, and that all third-party states must cease to provide any legal, political, or material support to Israel's occupation. Therefore, in light of this, there are four obvious ways to pressure Israel and to change the political status quo, and here I also mean the UK. Number one, a comprehensive arms embargo. Number two, sanctions. Number three, accountability. And number four, an immediate formal recognition of the state of Palestine.
May I ask you to pause there, because it's a very comprehensive answer, and we have some other questions specifically for you. And we don't want to repeat that, but there may well be many things that you've said in your statement that we would like to ask you further questions on. So given the time constraints that we have, if you wouldn't mind. I'd like John to ask some further questions, which I think you'd like to
thank
get
you.
some answers to.
Dr. Zomlot, can I begin? Do you unequivocally condemn the attacks carried out by Hamas on October the 7th?
We have been very, very clear from day one that we are not only committed to international law by words, but by deeds. And that's why the State of Palestine has sought the full force of international law. Of course, we reject wholeheartedly, fully, and in absolute terms, the targeting of civilians. That's clear. And we want international institutions to make sure that all war criminals are held accountable. And that's why it was the State of Palestine that actually ratified the Rome Statute and invited the ICC to investigate not certain war crimes, all war crimes, all violations of human rights, all violations of the basic provisions of international law. And as you know, sir, since then, it has been Israel that is blocking us from actually applying the full force of the law.
You'll be aware that there are reports of Palestinian diplomats celebrating what happened on the 7th of October, and that actually is creating part of the problem, that Israel will not have confidence in Palestine's commitment to a two-stage solution unless action is taken to de-radicalize the Palestinian population.
I haven't seen any Palestinian diplomat celebrating anything. Palestinian diplomats are busy trying to expose the ugly reality that we have been living in, not only since the 7th of October, and I've just said in my remarks, this is a war of extermination against the Palestinian people, but even before. On the 6th of October, right honorable friend, it was already reported by international institutions that that was the deadliest year as far as Palestinian children, not in Gaza, but in the West Bank at the hands of the Israeli military forces. So the diplomats are really busy trying to provide protection for our people. And I'd like to remind you also that on the 7th of October, of course, everybody was in a state of shock. But we were not even given a slice of time, as the shortest period of time just to comprehend. All what we got was Netanyahu, Herzog, and all Israeli leaders coming out and say, we are going to be after the Palestinian people. Those are political animals. We will kill all of you. And then Netanyahu quoting the Amalek, that they will kill every child, every woman, every animal. Of course, we went on the defense. And of course, we wanted to make sure that the 7th of October will not be used as a pretext to slaughter our people, and that is exactly what happened.
So, but do you accept that, as all of our witnesses so far have agreed, that a two-state solution is the only way of resolving this, and that will require the Palestinian population to live in peace side by side with the state of Israel?
That question needs to be asked to Netanyahu, really, not to me.
Well, we will, I'm sure, ask it to representatives of Israel, but can I ask you as a representative of the Palestinian Authority?
Yes, at least since 1988, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is the umbrella organization that represents all Palestinians, the PLO, which is the legitimate entity that represents all, and that's why the UK recognizes the PLO, the US does, and the UN and the rest of the world. In 1988, the PLO declared the State of Palestine on the 1967 borders in line with international consensus and international resolutions. A few years later, the PLO recognized Israel fully as a state, and since then, Israel has been, in my opinion, and in the given the events that has unfolded since then, blocking any possibility of a state. Israel never recognized the State of Palestine. That's why it gets me heated when I hear this question, because it's us who has been working tirelessly to implement international consensus towards a two-state solution. It's us who have recognized the State of Israel. It's Israel and Netanyahu for at least 25 years, since he was elected first prime minister, ingrained in the Likud charter there, and in the coalition agreement, the last Israeli government coalition agreement, that they will never allow for a State of Palestine.
Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Carrying on that point, is it not the case that a two-state solution can only be imposed and pushed for from outside powers? And what would you say that looks like?
It must. It must, because number one, either we have international order or we don't. Either we have law or we don't. You cannot be half committed about legality. And I think legality is very clear. Israel's occupation has got to end. It's almost 6 decades now. The rights of Palestinians towards self-determination has to be implemented, honored.
At the beginning you said the United States was unpredictable.
Yes.
We all expect something to happen when President-elect Trump comes to office.
Yes.
What do you expect from the US? And what other powers, Saudi Arabia, the UK, which outside powers should take a leading role in trying to deliver peace?
I expect one agenda to be advancing, which is the agenda of the rule of law. That's the agenda. There are so many regional and international actors who have different agendas. None of them have the agenda of the rule of law, of the post-World War II rules-based order, to be respected, to be strengthened, to take its responsibility, to apply the law equally on all. That's what I expect the agenda to resolve it. And look at all other conflicts. You will only find when there is such a sustained international intervention, they will resolve. You cannot leave the conflict to be resolved at the whim of this very huge asymmetric power relations between the occupied and the occupier, the colonized and the colonizer, the besieged and the besieger. So yes, we need external interventions. However, that's why I said the UK is very, very crucial at this point in time. You cannot do this in a half-committed way. You cannot be half-committed to legality, to the law. Look at all the policy options that could have helped us achieve a ceasefire, because a ceasefire will not be achieved without enforcing the ceasefire. And the same token, the two-state solution will not be implemented without enforcing the two-state solution. How do you enforce the two-state solution? How do you achieve ceasefire? Number one, you need the arms embargo. And look at the way, take it as an example, the UK did it, the UK government. It was half committed. We will stop some, we will make some exceptions, and the way it was communicated in the political sense. While the decision was sound legally, it was based on legal assessment. The political communication of it preempted any substantial sort of leverage. The same thing applies on the issue of sanctions. While we impose sanctions on the individual settlers, I mean the UK government, and in some settler organizations, still the ecosystem of the settlements is not being really sanctioned and bought. And the ecosystem includes the trade, includes the companies including UK companies that profit from these illegalities, including the government, the Israeli government that backs, supports, sponsors directly these illegal colonial settlements. So my answer to you is the only agenda that could resolve this conflict once and for all is an agenda that is multilateral, international, that has international law at the center of their attention, that really wants to apply the law equally, and ends once and for all this culture of impunity, that there is one entity that is above the law and the rule and the exception to every rule. There is why we haven't got to a two-state solution. When everybody, consensus, everybody says it's in the interest of Palestine, the interest of Israel, the interest of the region, the interest of the rest of the world. Why aren't we doing it? It's that half commitment. It's that, look at the US letter that was sent to Israel a month and a half ago. The US letter was very clear by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense to Israel. If you do not allow unfettered humanitarian aid, the US will impose an arms embargo in 1 month. The one month came, the 1 month went, and there was no consequences. There is the issue. The issue is when it comes to Israel, the West simply is unable to be fully committed to the very rules, to the very systems, to the very institutions the West has helped establish.
Thank you, Dr. Zomlot.
I have at least 4 people who want to ask you questions, and I'm a little concerned that we may end up with another one of our terribly disruptive votes, possibly more than one vote. So I'm going to need to ask people just to ask one question. I know that there are many more questions people want to ask, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist to one question each. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your representations. You talked about a lasting ceasefire, and you mentioned the kind of parameters within it, and the multi-year reconstruction plan, the withdrawal of Israeli forces and the freeing of hostages. I asked a similar question to the previous panel, so I'd love to know your answer to this. Do you think it's possible to reach this long-term settlement of the conflict in stages, starting with a ceasefire, or do you think there should be a simultaneous effort with the ceasefire and future solution negotiations being conducted in parallel?
You know, the Palestine is not the only conflict in the world. There have been many other conflicts, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. It's clear. Number one, you never negotiate the principles. You only negotiate the modalities of implementing the principles. So the first and the foremost step that we need right now is that the world establish these principles in legal stones. And it has been happening. The ICJ opinion was clear. The ICC ruling is clear. The UN General Assembly resolutions are clear. The UN Security Council resolution vis-a-vis ceasefire is stages, 3 stages, is clear. The problem is in implementation. It's in enforcement. And here comes the role of the US, the role of the UK, the role of key players that are the pinholders of the international system. So yes, it could be done once we establish such a clear path to everybody, and once we say it by deeds, not by words, that we recognize the 2 states. So the UK must recognize the state of Palestine now, before it's too late, if it's not already too late. Let's not waste more time. And then Palestine is admitted immediately as a full member in the UN. You know what would be the difference? We're done with the principles. It's in stones. There is no longer Israel and the Palestinians. It's Israel and Palestine. And then what we are discussing is minor details with the support of the international community. That is the shift we need to make. Otherwise, if it's just a function of disputed areas and group of people called Palestinians, you saw what Israel has up its sleeves up until this morning. And not only vis-a-vis Palestine, by the way, vis-a-vis the region.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ambassador, last week in an evidence session with the Alistair Burr, the former Middle East minister, we pushed him on Palestinian recognition and why the UK hadn't recognised Palestine when 3/4 of the General Assembly has. His point was that there was a right time to do that would create some kind of impetus to a peace process. I'm wondering if you support that view.
Support what? I'm sorry, the first one?
He suggested that there was a right time to recognise Palestine that in some way supported the peace process, and I'm wondering if you agree that there is a right time and if that's now or in the future.
Thank you for the question. I think the right time is now, absolutely now, and we are already late. And the question is not why should the UK recognize the state of Palestine. The question is why the UK did not recognize the state of Palestine until now. That's the only question. And the UK has missed so many opportunities, so many historic opportunities. It missed an opportunity in 2012 when we went to the UN General Assembly for a UN status for the state of Palestine. The majority of the world voted, the UK abstained. It missed an opportunity in 2014 when this House voted overwhelmingly for the recognition of the state of Palestine. It missed an opportunity in 2017, 100 years of the Balfour Declaration, and that was a moment when the UK could come and say, here it is, we take responsibility. And we are about to correct that historic injustice that has befallen the Palestinian people. Instead, the government then doubled down on the wounds of the Palestinian people. And you know the direct role Britain at the time played, that colonial, arrogant moment, promising our land without consulting us and turning us from the native population, the cradle of civilizations, the birthplace of Christianity, into non-Jewish minorities that only have civil and religious rights. By the way, up until now, that's the thinking in Israel. So, of course, Britain needs to do that. A, because recognition is a right, not a gift. And guess who said that, word by word? The current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. It's a right, not a gift, not a favor. What are you waiting for then? Number two, it is absolutely the right thing to do to really say that we mean a two-state solution, not only by words, but by action. And number three, it will send the right messages to Israel that, you know what, this is it, we mean it, we are serious. All of your expansion beyond the 67 will not be recognized. It will weaken the forces that will kill the possibility of a two-state solution, and it will empower those who want to see a different future So it's the most practical, and I'm not going to dwell into it. And I believe every day the UK waits is another day in the coffin of a hope, a real hope for a peaceful resolution, not only for Palestine, but for the entire region. And I think today it's very clear that the serious problem is the relationship between the West, including the UK and Israel. That relationship needs to be unpacked. That relationship needs to be unpacked. Because with all that support, unconditional support, and the lack of real political will to enforce a solution, I think Israel is going to drive itself and maybe the rest of us into a cliff. Recognition would be at least a very serious safety valve that no way, we are not going off a cliff. We will have to take a turn towards a shared future.
I change the subject slightly and go to Matt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador. What more can the UK do to encourage those holding British-linked hostages currently in Gaza to be released?
Push for the full and immediate implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2735 that the UK helped draft, sponsored and voted for. That's the key thing, because that resolution has a very clear stages where it begins by the release of and the exchange of hostages, that it outlines the stages of withdrawal, it outlines the roles of national and regional actors, and it has the consensus of the world. We have seen in November that hostages could be released via diplomacy, and given the situation now, and given what happened in Gaza for the last 14 months, I think the safest, best way to do so is to implement the UN Security Council resolution and to see hostages back to their families.
And why are those British-linked hostages not being... Why is the Red Cross not being able to go and see them?
The Red Cross should go and see them and should be able to see them. And
why are they not?
I don't know why they're not. Perhaps, perhaps not only the Red Cross. Gaza has been an arena of mass murder and destruction. This is the first time in history that such a situation is not being covered by international media. Even journalists are not allowed there. Even journalists. And that's why you had Palestinian journalists who have to cover the atrocities themselves, and 134 of them got killed. So not only why the Red Cross is not there, why the UN has been bombed.
Can I ask them, would you take the opportunity
Matt,
to call...
we've still got two more questions and we're going to run out of time. I'm so sorry. This ought to be your last question.
Okay. Well then, would you take the opportunity to call for Hamas to allow the Red Cross in to see those hostages?
Absolutely, and also to Israel to allow the Red Cross to access Israeli prisons that have turned into mass murder of Palestinian prisoners and rape that has been very documented. And I have never seen a parliament except the Israeli Knesset debating if raping Palestinian hostages is legitimate or not. So we want to see the Red Cross in Gaza, we want to see the Red Cross in Israeli prisons, and we want to see the ICC implementing their arrest warrant in Israel and everywhere else.
Sam.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Welcome, Ambassador. I want to start by offering condolences because I know that the real situation on the ground. People lose lives, and as I understand it, you've lost some of your family members as well. So, my sincere condolences to you. Just in relation to the settlements and on the West Bank, Ben-Gvir, the minister, has announced an expansion over the coming year. And he has said that he intends to submit further money from the Parliament just on expansions. What do you think this does for the recognition of a state, given that potentially it may no longer be viable?
Thank you very much, Right Honourable. And Ben-Gvir does not just mean expansion. I mean, he means annexation, and that's what they have been doing and working towards. And you may have heard the other fanatical minister in the Israeli government, that is Smotrich, who announced a few weeks ago that Israel will annex the West Bank by the year 2025. That's a few weeks ago. And of course, that's the agenda. That's exactly the agenda. And if you look, the agenda is that of very classic case of settler colonialism, very classic case of ethnic cleansing, And guess who said that this is ethnic cleansing? The former Minister of Defense, Israeli Minister of Defense, Bogi Ayalon, only a couple of weeks ago, that what Israel is doing now in the north of Gaza is a classic case of ethnic cleansing, coupled with the system that you may have documented here in this committee of military occupation, colonization, besiegement, and apartheid, very well documented by the human rights. This is the only future Israel is offered. There is no, and by the way, to limit this only to Netanyahu and the extreme right-wing members of his government does not serve justice to the situation. The majority of the Israeli political class now do not have a Palestinian state as part of the future. It's as simple, as absolute as that. And therefore, the question for us is, how do we challenge this reality? How do we challenge this reality? And the first and the foremost beginning of answering that reality is, how do we change this mindset? Because people are not evil. This is not just about Israelis being evil. It's about the mindset being evil. The mind frame is being evil. And convinced, because of many events happening around them, convinced that the only way forward is by this sheer revenge and reactions and mass murder and mass destruction and no future and no horizon and no peace and no partners, and they don't want to talk to anybody. They just want to use the US provided weapons on mass numbers of civilians. And I believe this is a moment when we need to tap on that shoulder and change that mindset. And you cannot leave it to us, the Palestinians, alone to do it. You cannot.
Ambassador, what can we do in terms of going further? So what actions can we take as a government to prevent settlements expanding and the violent settlers as well, so the increase in violence of settlers in the West Bank? What action do you think this government should be taking?
Exactly what is written in international law. Exactly why we have established the international system. States have responsibilities. And if they do not adhere by these responsibilities, then sanctions are merited. Sanctions are called for and must be implemented. Look at how we ended South Africa apartheid. We are not going to reinvent the wheel. Whenever it comes to Israel, we have to create all the exceptions in the world. Israel is no exception. It has violated every provision of international law, all the way to the genocide in Gaza. It has violated the provision of international law, even though the UN established Israel. Yet, Israel has been in awe with the very provisions of the United Nations. Israel believes that it has the UN Charter. There is a UN Charter for Israel and there are a UN Charter for the rest of the world. So what we need to do, I go back always, honorable friend, to the very premise of law. Because this isn't just about Israel, this isn't just about Palestine, this is about all of us. Look what is happening in the region now. Look what is happening elsewhere. Either we are serious about the equal application of law or not. So sanctions is important, arms embargo is important, and it's not just an ask, it's an obligation by the UK, it's an obligation by all third states. Once the ICJ in January, already 11 months ago, came out and said that the crime of genocide brought by South Africa against Israel is plausible, that genocide is plausible, the conversation should have been over, and we are looking at a former Attorney General here. The conversation should be over. Then the full force of the law must be applied. So how do you apply it? Why do you apply the law? You apply the law also, not only justice for the victims, but deterrence. You want to deter that mindset. That mindset. And therefore sanctions, arms embargo, accountability. Accountability. People are being so resilient of the idea that Israeli leaders should be held accountable. We hear Western leaders, politicians, saying that the ICC was not established for countries like the US or Britain or Israel. Seriously? So the ICC was established for the brown and the black and the yellow, not the white? This is a joke. This is the beginning of the end of the international system we built. That's why people of the South, people of the East, people everywhere are losing faith in that international system. That's why that system is under the biggest stress test you can imagine. So the answer to your question, honorable friend, is just apply the law. Put Israel under the law, not above it. And deal with this West-Israel relationship. Every morning, Emily, I hear a Western politician, a British politician, comes out and says Israel is our closest ally. I don't understand that. What about Europe? What about others? There is no daylight between us and Israel. How come? Israel is a state. The UK is a state. In some areas, when you voice concerns, criticisms against Israeli policy that includes a genocide, you are seen to be anti-British. And then they come out and they say, we have shared values with Israel, British politicians. Can you please, somebody tell me, what are these shared values? The shared values of what? Of supremacy? Of supremacy? Of wholesale denial of people's rights? Of ethnic cleansing? Of depopulating entire areas? 14,000 children have been slain over the last 14 months. 14,000! Do I need to list for you how many aid workers? The highest in the history of conflicts. The highest number of journalists, the highest number of doctors. Did you hear Dr. Husam Abu Safiyyah in the north of Gaza only last week? He had to bury his 15-year-old son that was killed in that hospital. His hospital and himself was severely injured, is being fought and fought hard because Israel is not only targeting lives, it's targeting livelihoods. They want to see no hospital, no school, no water, no nothing. And yet you hear Western politicians every single morning about shared values. Come out and tell us, come out of the closet and tell us, what are these shared values? That relationship needs to be visited, looked at, and then Israel needs to put exactly what it should be. If Israel wants to be a member of the UN, and you saw the Israeli ambassador to the UN shredding the UN Charter, literally shredding the UN Charter. If Israel wants to be part of the UN, part of the community of nations, part of the region, it cannot exist because it bombs the region. It has bombed Lebanon, it is bombing Syria, it's bombing everywhere. It exists because the region accepts it. And the region has offered Israel a formula of acceptance. That formula is very clear. Resolve the Palestinian issue, end your occupation, and we will normalize you and the relationship not only with 22 Arab countries, but with 75 countries. Do you know how old that model is, formula? More than 25 years. Since 2002, 23 years. And it was completely disregarded. Because Israel wants to bypass the Palestinian issue. Israel wants to be normalized without resolving the Palestinian issue. Why am I going so long with this? Because I think the problem is not just Israel. Because, Israel is like any other state. If you can have the cake and eat it too, why not? So Israel needs to receive consequences, and not just Israel. Anybody who violates the very provisions of the system we built needs to be brought to accountability. So the answer is again and again in the rule of law.
I want to bring Blair in, and if we're able to get through Blair's questions, I'm going to let Uma ask another question because I know that she wanted to ask another one. But we're still dependent on the bells of the votes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can I also acknowledge and offer my condolences for your family's suffering over the last 14 months. In your mission statement, you call for a just and equitable solution to the issue of Palestinian refugees. Could you expand on what that means in practice, and whether there is room for negotiation and alternative arrangements within that desire for the return of refugees?
Can I ask you, Barin, why, Right Honourable, why do you think that statement is problematic? A just resolution to the issue of refugees?
I don't think it's problematic. I'm asking you to outline what it means in practice.
It means what it means. It means that 2/3 of the Palestinian people were ethnically cleansed from their homes and farms and livelihoods in 1948. Those became the biggest refugee issue in the region and in the globe. That's why the UN had established international law vis-à-vis how to resolve the issues, including Resolution 194. And that's why the UN also established UNRWA to service these refugees until their issue is resolved. And that's exactly why Netanyahu is targeting UNRWA, because he's linking UNRWA to the right of return, and he's wrong there. UNRWA is just to provide services to the refugees, but the right of return is enshrined in their property rights. I mean, there is the collective and there is the individual. Those people, including my own father and grandfather, they have deeds to their own homes. So we cannot brush this issue under the carpet. And this is not an issue just up for negotiation and compromise. I think we have to make a distinction between the principle and the sort of resolutions. And the principle has got to be accepted. Israel has to take its responsibility, acknowledge its wrongdoing in 1948, the Nakba. Peace will not be done or achieved or enjoyed if it's not based on justice. And this is not a statement. Go everywhere. Without achieving justice, peace is not sustainable. We have tried it many times. And how can you tell 2/3 of the Palestinian people, oops, we have negotiated your rights away? But there are models. There are international models. Look at the Balkans. There are options that are given to these people. And if I want to offer Israel a deal, it has to be a final deal where everybody is satisfied and the future is going to be shared. But this business of haggling, this business of haggling, can you please forego the right of return before we begin to speak? Can you just compromise this? Can you compromise further that? Let me say this, Baron, allow me. Peace means the three following things for us. And whatever happens, these three rights have to be achieved. Number one,
may I just would be very good. I very much like to hear the three points, but I think I'll then need to draw your evidence to a close. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm just saying you're about to say that the peace will depend on three things, and if you would be kind enough to tell us those, but then I'd need to bring your evidence to an end.
First, the right to self-determination. We are a nation, peoplehood on our land, and we have functioning government. We have got to have a state that can protect us, and look what happened to us over the years, and can represent us internationally and provide for us a political democratic system. Number two, the right of return and the right of refugees to be resolved, and I believe there are already formulas that would be satisfactory. And number three is being treated equally wherever we are. However, the business of let's push the Palestinians a bit more is not going to do. The minimum we could accept, the maximum we could offer is what have been on the offer for the last 35 years. A state of Palestine on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, resolving the issue of refugees and treating Palestinians with dignity and equality everywhere. And I believe these are not asks, these are obligations upon any party that deals with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for giving us your time. Thank you. We're going to try and get into the next panel. Okay.
Very imminent, it says.
Can we switch over from panel 2 to panel 3? Order. Our final panel is going to talk to us about the position of the hostages taken in October 2023. We're really grateful to you for coming today. Thank you. And I wonder if you could introduce yourself for the record, please.
My name is Sharone Lifschitz. I am a British citizen, mother of a British citizen, wife of a British citizen living in the UK. I am the daughter of Oded and Yocheved Lifschitz. Both of them were taken hostage on the 7th of October. I am the daughter of Kibbutz Nir Oz, a community in the Negev desert that suffered perhaps statistically the most in this war, in the sense that a quarter of its members were either taken hostage or murdered on that day. Every house, apart from 6, were entered. Many of them were destroyed and burned. My parents' house was burned to the ground. Nothing is left. I am here after 431 days of a continuous failure to return my father. My mom returned after 17 days to us. I want to say a few things about my parents.
Please do.
I want to start by saying that their life was devoted to building a community and to finding a peaceful solution and working with our neighbors. I think you can define it that the life work has been about averting what happened on the 7th of October. And I think always, again and again, to my father lying on the ground, injured, Both of them were in the safe room. They thought it was safe. My father was injured when he was shot through the door. My father is 84, my mom is 86 now. And they were in their pajamas in the morning. When my father held the door, a few minutes before, he said he could hear voices in Arabic. My father speaks good Arabic. And within seconds, he was shot, and then 6 men entered the room. They took my father out, dragged him out, and later, minutes later, took my mom. They wrapped her in a blanket, and the last thing my mom saw of my father after 63 days of living together was him lying unconscious on the floor. When she returned to us, she told me the first thing in the hospital was that father is dead. He wasn't dead. He woke up at one point, lying there. He saw our house on fire. He saw the children of our community being taken hostage. He saw dead bodies all over. My mom, when she was taken, had hundreds of civilians running towards our community with sticks and stone, shouting, "Kill the Jews, Itbach al-Yahud, and Allahu Akbar." She herself was was defended by the people taking her on a motorbike. She was lying like that on a little motorbike going through the fields. She came back after 17 days and famously shook the hand of her captor.
We all remember that. We all remember that.
It might have looked out of the ordinary, but knowing my mom, it was a very ordinary thing to do. It was the thing she has done all her life, which is seeing people, for being humans. And I think that this committee itself should really look at human beings beyond the conflict and seek to find ways to restore our faith in humanity and each other. But we should also remember that taking hostages is an incredibly horrific thing to do. That I am kind of surprised by the gentleman who sat here before me, because he did not fully condemn it. You have to go.
I'm so sorry. We do need to go. I mean, we probably have another minute, but then we have to run. But if you have another minute, we will come back. But it may be that it will be half an hour. I'm so sorry. This is the system that we labour under.
Order.
Then I will say.
Might be better waiting.
It's fine. We can come back and speak to you in half an hour, and if that works
Let's
better,
wait, so you're
then
not
that's what we'll do.
back.
Order. You were in the middle of telling us the most horrendous story before we had to finish to go and vote. I visited Niroz and knew it to be extraordinary community that was certainly peaceful, and the people within it were working with Palestinians as best they could. And you had, I'm afraid, got to the part of your tale where you were explaining about your father being on the ground, and then we're about to move on, and I'm afraid we then all had to run off and vote.
Okay.
If please tell us what you. Please, the floor is yours, and your evidence is yours, in your own way, and as best you can. Please help us with the rest of the tale as to what had happened to you and to your family.
I think that about 4 days after, we had the first press conference, which was televised extensively here. And I think I said then, and I feel it's still true, that my enemy is hate, that it is hate that has been kind of washing over our streets in the UK in a way I could not imagine at the time. And if I have to say what this Parliament should do more of, we talk about peace as if it should be in the Middle East. I don't feel there is peace happening here. If the UK want to have a role in what happens next in the Middle East, I think that the first panel has quite clearly explained to us that there will need to be bridge building. I don't see Parliament doing anything for bridge buildings at the moment. Meaning I've been quite vocal about my opinions about the matter. I've been quite vocal about what should happen with the hostages. I've been quite vocal about thinking how we get from here to hostages release and the return of some sanity for the people of the region. I often talk about the people of the region. Apart from the joint statement of the Liberal Democrats in their conference, I haven't been witnessing really very much that is about finding a unified story that helps the hostages return first and foremost, but I think, as the Prime Minister said, this will be done as part of a negotiated ceasefire. I think if you ask me what needs to be done, that's one of them. But I think we should maybe go to you.
I think Adam was going to introduce our clients.
So, good afternoon. I'm Adam Rose. I'm a solicitor and partner at Mishcon Reya in London. And along with Adam Wagner, I act for the families of the British and what we know as the closely connected hostages. And we'll explain what we mean by that shortly. Just to name who these hostages are, who we're talking about, the human beings. The hostages are Emily Damari, who is British, Odette Lifschitz, whose daughter, Dr. Sharone Lifschitz, you've been listening to, who is British. Eli Sharabi, whose British wife Leanne and teenage daughters Yahel and Noya were murdered on the 7th of October 2023. And his brother, Yossi Sharabi, who was taken hostage and who was killed in January of this year. Avinatan Or, whose mother is British. We were also acting previously for Nadav Popplewell, who was British, who was also killed, and his body has been recovered and he has been buried. As a result of our advocacy, the UK government, both the previous government and the current government, are committed to treating all of these people in exactly the same way as each other, both the British and the closely connected hostages. But today is over 430 days since the 7th of October 2023, and as lawyers, one step removed from the family, we see occasional glimmers of progress. We saw the Prime Minister calling for the unconditional and immediate release of the hostages a few weeks ago, but we don't see the UK taking specific action for its citizens and for those closely connected to the UK to whom it committed to seek their immediate and unconditional release.
We would be very grateful during your evidence if you could be clear about what action you think that the British government should take, because the focal point in this inquiry is what have the British done until now that has worked and what might work in the future. Adam.
Thank you. My name's Adam Wagner and I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I've been working along with Adam for the past 14 months for the British-linked hostage families. I just want to say a couple of things in that context, not quite about what this government can do, because I think we'll come to that, but more about why this government should care, and that's been part of the challenge. You know, the first few weeks that we were trying to interest the British government, we weren't receiving much back. I think that the letters said, and from the Foreign Office said, here's a leaflet on how to get through this very difficult situation, but it's not our responsibility. And to their credit, the previous government came on something of a journey. We spent a lot of time here advocating for them to be bothered, and at the time there were 2 British citizen hostages and a number of very closely connected hostages. Just on the basics, one of the most important things, there's so many extraordinary and terrible things that have happened in this part of the conflict, as you've been hearing about, that it's easy to forget individual elements that themselves are extremely important and extraordinary, and the taking of 251 hostages on the 7th of October is one of those extraordinary elements that needs to really be thought through. And those 251 hostages were mostly civilians. They were women, men, children, older people, including Sharone's parents. In fact, the first contact I had was from Stella Creasy, who is Sharone's MP, just after the 7th of October, saying, I've got a constituent whose elderly parents have been taken hostage. At the time, we didn't know what British connections there would be. There's a baby who is still a hostage. There are people who were shot and injured and who were taken hostage. There are people who are ill. There are still 101 hostages. There are 22 nationalities amongst those hostages. This is very much an international situation because of those different nationality hostages, and among them the 4 closely connected to British hostages. Hostage taking is unambiguously a war crime. It's a crime under it's contrary to the International Convention against taking of hostages, which the British are party to. It's a crime in our domestic law because that's one of our treaty commitments to make it a crime. It's a crime under the 1982 Act. And the British state has a responsibility as a signatory of that treaty to work together with other states to ensure that and coordinate a response against hostage taking. And the other point to make is it's not just hostage taking, it's an act of terrorism. That those 251 hostages being taken was an act of terrorism by a prescribed terrorist group. And Sharone here and the hostages and the people we work with are victims of terror. And that adds a whole other element. These aren't people who are being kept, in places where the Red Cross can reach. A lot of the families have had no confirmation of life in the last 14 months. There's no access to aid for those hostages. There's no access to medicines. There's no access to medical treatment. Nobody can go in and see where they are. Some of them were being held in tunnels. Some of them being held in civilian homes. We had a client whose mother was released who had been held in the house of a lawyer for 2 months, who was being paid to hold that hostage in a family home. It's extremely, extremely complex and difficult. And if it is left to carry on and it's not properly addressed by not just Israel but by the international community, then that's an encouragement for it to happen again and for it to be used as a tactic. And just the final thing I'd say is it's a very successful tactic. that the point of the hostage taking, it wasn't just a random act. It's something that the terrorist organizations such as Hamas have been trying to achieve and have been doing for years. And as a tactic, it works because it's a form of psychological terror. It creates divisions within societies, divisions within the families who are just trying to advocate for their loved ones. And I'll just end with this, that Nadav Popplewell, who was the other British hostage who was murdered, before he was, and we were acting for the family, before his death was announced, Hamas released a number of videos, sort of a bit like a game show, where they said, guess what's happened to Nadav Popplewell? ... And they showed a picture of him with a black eye, a video of him with a black eye. You'll find out in 24 hours, watch this space. And then they released another video in 24 hours saying, out of these 3 hostages, 2 are dead. Which ones do you think it is? You'll find out in 24 hours. And then 24 hours later, they revealed that he had died. That's the other British hostage. And that's just a sample. And that's the same thing happened with Yossi Shirabi as well, as another one of our clients who was killed. So just in amongst all of the horror of all of this, this is a very particular form of horror that Sharone and her family and 251 other families have had to be dealing with. And I think that's really important just to highlight.
Yes, thank you for telling us that. Afra, do you have any questions? And I think once Afra's asked some questions, I'm going to open it up if anybody has any others.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult the last 431 days have been for you, Sharone, and your family. Do you believe that the UK is doing enough to try and help bring your father home? And, what action in particular would you like to see from the government?
I think, first of all, I don't know. We have failed to bring my father back home, so I personally feel a huge sense of failure. I don't think anybody involved in it can feel it's been a success. So in that respect, no. I think the government must be very clear, continuously clear, that it has citizens and closely linked hostages, and that they are responsible for them. And their responsibility is 100%. Do you see? So I have a problem when I'm being told by the government of Israel, no, take responsibility for your hostages, work in a creative way, work in any way possible, be absolutely clear that this is not the problem of the Israeli government that you are trying to support in the best way possible, but it is a problem for Britain that has British citizens held hostage, not seeing any medical help, held in terrible conditions. And, I used to look at Nadine Zadawi-Ratcliffe and think, God, that's terrible. I used to be one of the people sitting at home thinking that's terrible. And then on the 7th of October, me and my family were going up north to pick a puppy, and my life turned on its head. And I think the way things are going, other people's life also are going to turn on their head. So we have to look at how we support each other. The fact that it took so long for the government to come and support me as a British citizen, mother of a British citizen, wife of a British citizen, says something. So I think that's another thing we need to look. What is the responsibility we have for British citizens whose life is turned upside down?
I think specifically, can I just widen Afra's question to the lawyers? Because I think, we do, if there is a list of things that is felt that the British government should do, then we'd like to hear them. I take on board completely your criticisms in relation to the British government being slow to take responsibility for the families of hostages and for the hostages themselves, and I think that applies to your case and to people taken hostage, Israelis taken hostage, and to many others, and I know many of us around this table are exercised by that and continue to be. But specifically, if there are things which are demands or suggestions that are made, then we would like to hear them, please.
So I think one of the challenges that the families have put to the government is the apparent lack of creativity in their thinking. So having conducted the same activities for 14 months without success, it's not obvious that there is a group of people thinking of different ways of approaching things. We have very much approached this, and the families have very much approached this as victims of terrorism, as individuals, rather than as people who have political solutions for big or small questions. But there seems to be a lack of preparedness for something which has happened, which was not beyond contemplation, and having happened, it's not beyond contemplation that something similar could happen again in that jurisdiction or somewhere else. There is no standard operating procedure that kicks in when this happens. So the families had to work out for themselves what to do. There was no blueprint for what to do, and one would hope that a blueprint could be put in place so that you know what happens next. The UK, to give it credit, the government has set up a Gaza hostage unit headed by Charles Hay, who is an ambassador level person. That unit has provided weekly information to the hostage families as to what's going on. They don't give classified information, but they give information which is very publicly available, but more importantly, they give information of things which are not publicly available, things that don't hit the press, get into the weekly briefings. And I think all of the families have found that to be very helpful. So in terms of building a blueprint, you would say, well, we need to kick into action immediately a dedicated team. We need to give information to families. We need to have counsellors available. We need to have politicians available. We need to have civil servants available. I don't know, Adam, if you wanted to add some other thoughts.
It's not an easy question to answer because it's unclear still the extent to which Britain has in its gift excuse me, the ability to influence this situation. And we've been told very different things. I mean, we've been dealing with 2 different governments, 3 different foreign secretaries, 2 different prime ministers, and our hostage families have met them all. And so we've heard different things, and we've been told that Britain has got no influence at all in the Middle East. That's from on that range to Britain can do something. And my experience, from 14 months is that what the state, the sort of structural influence that the state has is quite different to the influence that high-level politicians can have in these situations, because ultimately they are quite, it's 100 people, it's a few people, quite a small group who are negotiating. The influence can be brought to bear by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, if they want to. That's our experience, and it really comes down to leadership. Does this country want to be a leader in fighting against international terrorism and particularly hostage taking? That's that I haven't seen from either government. To be fair, the Prime Minister standing up and saying this is leaving aside all of the really difficult issues of negotiation and the 2-state solution and all of the wider political consequences. This in itself is an extremely serious issue which needs to be dealt with on its own. It's a war crime on its own. It has no defence. It's not part of. It might be end up being part of a negotiation, but it doesn't need to be. So I think taking leadership on that issue is something that this country could do more of, and I don't see what the downside would be of that. From an international law perspective as well, this is a government that respects international law, and I'd like to see that. There's talk of appointing a hostage sort of czar or envoy or whatever it would be on the American model. I think that is a good idea as long as that person is properly resourced and isn't a replacement for the government doing its own thing. I would see that person as more of like a victims commissioner, someone who will stand up for all the different families who are impacted by hostage taking and arbitrary detention across the piece. So that and go to government and stand up and be an out in public person who will hold them to account. That's the way I see that. It's not a substitute. And I think the other point, I think the quite narrow but really, really important point for these British linked families is the government needs now, if there's going to be a deal, which hopefully there will be, and there could be one quite soon, and we all hope. There seems to be gathering possibility of a deal and more impetus. The government needs to be saying every single day, privately and publicly, we have 4 British connected hostages who we have taken responsibility for. We have told all of the families that we take responsibility for them, and we demand that they are released. We demand and we will pay. I don't mean pay financially, because I don't think the UK does that with hostages, but we will give our time, we will give our resources to making this happen. The UK has chosen not to be in the room, and we've been told repeatedly that that's a specific choice that they've made. Said that let the Americans and the Qataris and the Israelis and the Egyptians do the direct negotiations, and we'll be in the outer circle, sort of influencing if we can. That's a choice as well, and it's not a choice that necessarily needs to be continued. Britain could take more responsibility, but for me it comes down to leadership, taking responsibility, and right now, and we would hugely appreciate if this committee could write a letter, immediately and say to the government, now you need to be standing up for these particular individuals who you've taken responsibility for as part of this process.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sharone, for coming to speak to us today, and it's heartbreaking to hear the experiences that you've had over the last 14 months. I just wanted to pick up on, you mentioned Kattan, and I was going to ask, Kattan was leading negotiations. Hamas have been residing there. They've now pulled away from leading those negotiations. But during that time, was there any part of that process that you felt able to access through the British government?
Yeah, I think actually the British government arranged for us, the British-linked hostages, to go to Qatar. There was a trip to Qatar in July organized by the British government. There was also several meetings with Qataris in the UK. So in that respect, yes. But I have to tell you that I've been trying really hard to figure it for 14 months, and you very often hear very opposite things about the role of Qatar, and you very often hear very opposite things from members of the government, and you somehow have to decide where you stand on it. And therefore, I'm not elected, I wasn't elected to be a hostage daughter, and I'm trying to figure it out. I figured out that a lot of the time also that politicians don't know. I figured out there's things I don't get access to, I don't know. I think, though, at the heart of it is the question of Hamas, and one of the things that really surprised me about the Zomlot's presentation, that very rarely was he challenged on Hamas, and it is Hamas who kind of prepared the population for this. Hamas who took hostages, Hamas who put the hostages in hospitals and put them in people's homes, Hamas who put friends of my mother in the home of UNRWA employees. And so there's this kind of generalities that he talk about Israel as if all of Israel is the same. Well, I know my friends are demonstrating against the government for years in any way possible, and yet he took no responsibility for Hamas. And I think that the British government is not always really clear, because the British government says we don't negotiate with a terrorist organization. Hamas is a terrorist organization. First of all, this needs to be revisited, because my parents are not held by nice people. They are terrorists, but they are holding my father. So how do we overcome this is one question. that this committee has to somehow think deeper about. And the second, we have to challenge people who come to this committee and talk about Palestine as if everybody are just ready for peace and spend 3 generations building a peace kind of outlook, and yet looking at Israel, in which 70% of the population is pro a deal, and suggesting that all of us are, this or that. I think we need the intricacies of the complexity of the situation.
Blair, shall I ask you first and then
just to say that I know I wouldn't find the grace that you have in the situation that you find yourself in, so thank you so much for being with us today. Adam mentioned the suggestion of setting up the special envoy around people who are arbitrarily detained or are hostages. Much of the conversation about that we've had in this committee, or that I've been party to in the chamber, has been about state hostages. And there's been a lot of work on the criticism of people in that situation in terms of the experience of loved ones. I'm interested, you mentioned about the need for counsellors and things that were lacking. I'm interested in what was the experience like of being someone in this situation in terms of, you mentioned the unit that has been set up now, but the permanent capacity of the Foreign Office in terms of giving you, as a relative of someone who was taken hostage, what was the experience of that like, in terms of the support that you were given? And feel free to be as critical as you like, because that's our job.
There hasn't been that experience, in the sense that I don't think the British government has at all offered me much support as a victim. They offered me considerable support in pushing the fight for the return of my father. So in that way, I think there's a lot of work to be done. I know other governments have done more for it. And I think that there is, until today, I was not offered any of that support. Not in the sense that, I haven't worked since my parents were taken hostage. I think we don't even understand the effect of it on us, on our life. And so, nobody went into it thinking it will take 430 days with no end in sight. My father is very elderly. I do not know if he's alive or dead for 430 days. I thought he was dead. My mom told me he was dead. Then the hostages came back and told us he's alive, but he wasn't feeling well. Now we don't know. It's just ongoing. And somehow, I didn't know that I would go to Berlin last week, but I went. My life is forever on the edge, because I'm here and I have a crap situation, but the hostages are there, and I don't know at what point, they won't be there. Each of them has the moment, they die, and we don't even know the date. We don't even know the circumstances. We don't even know if somebody said a nice word to them. It's really hard to carry it. It's very, I talk about the failure a lot, but I feel it because we have gone such a long way, but we haven't arrived at our destination, and the destination is the return of the hostages.
We heard from the Foreign Secretary ourselves, and he gave a commitment to a form of ambassador, someone who's with responsibility for taking a lead on those who are arbitrarily detained. And there's little detail in terms of fleshing that out, and there was a debate in Parliament, and there was a challenge, for example, to put out a definition of what it is to be arbitrarily detained, but also to look closely at the American model, where there seems to be a very proactive view, at least, in terms of thinking laterally, working out kind of, who the power players may be behind the person being held. Does anybody have connections with them? How do you put pressure on them? Who might know them? Obviously, state actors can have sanctions, jailers can have individual sanctions, that sort of thing. And the other side of the coin being that the support, the emotional support which is given to hostage families, so that when it is decided that someone's been arbitrarily detained, within hours the family is contacted and they're given phone numbers and told, right, we're now looking after you. You can ring us at any time. There are advisors. There's mental health, assistance. I mean, there's a whole panoply of things. We've not heard about any of that. I'm sorry, this is not. I'm just setting this out before I get to my question, which is, when you talk about there being a specific group, or there's been an initiative to give support to the families of Gaza hostages. I wondered how close that might be to any hopeful model that the government may move towards.
You know what, I'm sitting here and it makes me think that, even my workplace never got advice. Yes. For the first time, I don't think that a university had a hostage family member as a member of staff. Everything they do, the suggestion they make, and they've been kind to me, the University of East London, but they have no clue. Nobody contacted them and said, so in a sense, my predicament never came outside of the Foreign Office. As a citizen of this country, I have not been addressed in any way. My doctor has not been addressed. Nobody's been addressed, So I think I haven't even thought about it because their situation in Gaza is so much worse. But when you raise that, then I think me as a citizen, there's been nothing. Yeah. Nobody asked me if financially I'm okay, if I'm mentally okay, if in any other way I'm okay. Nobody.
Uma is behaving appallingly and insisting on getting a question in before Matt, but I will let her, because I didn't let her ask a question earlier.
Thank you for your evidence today and the dignity and courage that you have to recount this story of what's happened to your family. That strength that you have, I pay tribute to. Just want to offer my help. The University of East London is actually in my constituency, so I'm very happy to meet with you. I'm very happy to write to them. Whatever support you need, please, take it. I'm 5 months into the job, so I wasn't aware of this, but certainly I'm very happy to meet with them and speak to them to offer you some support.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Matt.
Thank you, Chair. We heard from the ambassador earlier calling for Hamas to allow the Red Cross in to see hostages. I know that the Red Cross were involved in the early deal that saw your mother come out. I wondered what your experience of working with the Red Cross is, and for our legal minds, what the legal status is of not allowing them in, and what levers might be available to the UK in getting them access.
Sharone, your experience?
I think it's a dead end. I think it's not worth debating. It's a waste of time. Whatever I think about what its remit is and what they can do, they can't do anything. So, the Qataris cannot get us a proof of life. So, I don't know. It's not working. I think we should try to do it a different way, but maybe you have a different idea.
We have tried a lot, and our families have met with the Red Cross multiple times in multiple countries. And the Red Cross approach is it's just too dangerous. We can't force our way in. It relies on consent. And I think that the people who focus on the Red Cross, I can completely understand why, because and there was a deal that France did to try and get medication in, and then the medication was found in a hospital with the names of the hostages on it, and it comes back to the point of that this is a terrorist organisation that for very many years built hundreds of miles of tunnels with the purpose of using for a future conflict, including taking hostages. That's why they've got rooms with toilets and kitchens in those tunnels, which only the fighters and the hostages live in. And they're so frightened, for what we understand of anybody finding them, that they'd communicate by sort of paper notes rather than electronic communications. The idea that they would let the Red Cross meet the hostages and expose the locations, I think, it seems to be, unreal. And that's our experience. I mean, it'd be great if they could be let in, but it's a terrorist organisation that it doesn't react to sanctions. You can't be. I mean, you can be sanctioned if you can find the money. It doesn't react to international pressure in the same way. It's not a state. So I think that's the framework to have to understand it, and I don't want to be despairing about it, but we've found no glimmer of light in that respect of letting anybody in. I mean, they don't even know who's alive and who's dead.
Yes.
You know, just as a starting point, forget medicine or food. They don't know who. You know, there might be very few alive. Who knows?
We've seen some of the families in Israel who've indicated their unhappiness that perhaps the Israeli government isn't giving release of the hostages the priority it should be. I just wondered what your view of what the Israeli government is doing and whether they should be doing more.
It's a big question. I'm not satisfied with the Israeli government. I think absolutely they could do more. I think it's a complicated thing as well. I mean, you know, the last week with the collapse of Syria again changes everything. I believe they could have. There was points at which a deal could have been reached, and that if the hostages were the main objective, a deal would have been reached, and our loved one would have been here. I'm absolutely certain that in that case, more of them would have come alive, and some of the people we have buried since would have come alive. I think Israel has its worst government. As the first panel suggested, we need fresh leadership on both sides in order to push things. I think Israel needs a solution, and I think there's 4,000 years of solution, and the hostages will not survive reaching that state. That's why we are asking for it immediately and unconditionally, because we feel them in our stomach, and they're not going to survive another winter. They simply, it's too much. And I think that's why the British government, the Israeli government, should press in any way possible on the Israeli government to reach a deal together with everybody else. Only a deal returns them alive. My mother in the tunnels were petrified of the Israeli military getting close, because she said it's like a spider web of tunnels, and in that spider web of tunnels, how can they stop them from shooting us? And that's what happened when Israel got closer to the 6 hostages on the 1st of September. So Israel can and should do more to return the hostages, but I think also Britain should do more to return the hostages.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the evidence that you've given today and for the time that you've given us. And again, I apologise once more for the way that this place organises itself and for the difficulties that we had. But I'm going to, and if you feel that there's anything additional that we should know about that you didn't speak about in the heat of the moment, then please do write to us and we will add that to your evidence. Thank you again for your time. Order, the sitting.